Opening government, we have KNUSTD. Opening opposition, we have KNUSTB. Closing government, we have Veritas A. And closing opposition, we have KNUSTA. The motion for the semifinals is this House supports the continued existence of consumer company monopolies in Africa. So the debate keeper is going to be here. The timer and the bell is as follows. 1 minute, 6 minutes, 7:15. After 7:15, no judge will be recording anything. We do wish you guys all the best of luck. And apart from that, Prime Minister, whenever you're ready. And these are the reasons why these guys it simply just means that we want them to continue producing.
Due to things like those things, people are still willing to buy those things because they rate specific quality. Why is it very important to bring to this debate? Because when you rate those prices and those specific things, you don't have any doubt on that side because they are still buying these things because of the brand loyalty, because of the quality that provides them. That means that there's no doubt on that side because people are continuing to purchase these things. The problem that is created is that if you raise prices without any impact, then people cannot necessarily be able to buy the things that makes them actualize within this specific state. That means that there's no delta on their side, and that's why the comparative is ridiculous. The second thing to note here is that the counterfactual on their side can be that, oh well, we want multiple foreign companies, right? That's one of their counterfactuals. Why is this bad? Because those things can still inure to the accounts that they're trying to analyze, i.e. capital flights and stuff like that, right? It's because most of their comparative is where most foreign corporations will come and you still have their competition. That means that money will still fly out at the end of the day, right? So, second thing, panel, what are the benefits that we get from these guys? Number one, note that due to things like economies of scale, these guys are able to employ more people within this specific state. Why is this relevant? Because number one, governments are unable to employ these people because of the lack of resources. And why is this relevant again? Because when you are able to employ those people It leads to things like crime, right? Because there are no opportunities for these guys to go to actualize within the state. It leads to things like ethnic tensions and secessionist tendencies because people feel that they are not benefiting enough from the state, even though the reason is not because of that. They just feel that the state is not providing enough for them. And this is true because most African countries are characterized by this ethnic instability and stuff like that. But second thing to note is that smaller guys cannot be able to give us all the benefits, employment and those things. Why? Because most of these guys, smaller guys, cannot afford the shocks that exist within the market, because most African countries are characterized by both economic and political shocks because of the poor way in which these countries are run. Because they can't afford these shocks, that means that they are likely to raise their prices to cater for these shocks. So for smaller companies to float, they are likely to raise their prices, right? And that means that for the the reason why that's also relevant again is because they cannot be able to give us all the benefits that we want, i.e. employment, right? And because they don't produce at economies of scale, they cannot be able to afford to employ more people like these guys do. Fourth thing to note is that FDIs are some things that are guaranteed in our side of the house. Why? Because most people invest in these countries because they know that, oh, foreign corporations exist there, Unilever exists there. That means that that country is more likely to be stable, right? And these are the things that affect people pushes people to invest within this country. There's signaling of viability and stability because a lot of corporations exist there. Why is this relevant? Because most developing countries in Africa, about 70% of their budget relies on things like FDI. In a world where you signal that we don't want these foreign corporations, or we don't want these monopolies, these foreign corporations who are usually monopolies, you signal that you are open to investment and foreign investment. You lose about 70% of your budget on your side. But I note that most of these guys engage in things like social corporate responsibility. Why? Because they want to hire better people. So they usually give scholarships to children within these countries to go to school, and they later employ them. They usually build roads and those things. Why? Because they want better supply chain network in order to reduce their costs. That means that they give benefit to these communities, and know that on their side, government is unable to do that because they don't have enough money. Secondly, the small guys that they want to bring in cannot do that because, once again, they don't have enough money, right? But in the world where you sack them, you signal that you don't want investment, and that's why their world is problematic. Before I move on, closing. Opening.
FDIs are not unilateral. They can invest in local companies for them to set up. They don't have to come and set up.
Yeah, so that's the thing. I would want to invest in Nestle because I know my returns are assured, as opposed to some random company, like some country whose returns I'm not assured of, right? Because those guys are usually more established, right? So you know your returns are assured. They will say, oh, well, potential, right? I don't think people are willing to go to the extremes of risking their money. They go for assured benefits. Last thing I'm going to talk about is lobbying and capitalist control, because I think that's going to be the biggest selling points. The problem with these things is not the corporations. The problem is the shitty government and the shitty politicians who continuously make shitty conditions. Why is this framing relevant? Because on our side, companies can threaten to leave these countries if political parties and governments are doing bad things. Why? Because of signaling in things like the West, where most of your consumer base lies. Those guys can threaten to cancel you, right? And that means that you can also threaten to leave these smaller countries if they are doing wrong things. But on their side, because smaller companies, right, are not established enough, they cannot be able to like exert that same level of control, right? That means that countries, governments, can be doing all the bad things, and you do not have any redress for them, right? And know that they are still shitty on the counterfactual, right, and can oppress small guys, i.e. these governments, right, and that's why their world is problematic. But know that these big corporations build buildings and infrastructures, right, and their profits that they get, are tied to these countries, right, and so they are likely to be able to check these governments and ensure that they're being stable, because if the government is going bad, your profits will lose out, and that means that they're likely to be more stable on our side. Proudly opening government.
We would like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. We'd now like to welcome the leader of opposition to continue the debate. Hear, hear.
I'll prioritize closing for POIs. Monopolies check the government. This is nonsense, because what it means is that in the same way, if the government is trying to protect local businesses, they can threaten to pull out. They never show how if a government at one point tries to defend its internal resources those monopolies would not want to leave. We think that at a point where your monopoly is a threat to independent government action, such that you hold the government at ransom, we think it's terrible. 2, status quo proves that Vincent lies a lot, and so my LO case will not just be framing, but dismantling a lot of things that they say. In DR Congo, in Cameroon, Nigerian Shell, all those companies stayed in the times of terrorism. They never threatened to leave if terrorism doesn't stop. It's unclear how those companies would want to stop, especially when those unstable situations allow them to escape the law more, because the grip that the state has on those systems are less. Secondly, they say a lot of things that are non-comparative. 1, well, if there are monopolies, people want to invest. No, having a monopoly means that your market is saturated, and so if they want to invest in another company, that company cannot grow. Why would they come and invest in a saturated market? On our side, people are more likely to invest because they know that there is competition and there is potential for that investment to grow. Secondly, they say things like, well, what do they call it? Social corporate responsibilities. This is non-comparative. Why do you have to own 80% of a market share before you build a school or a road? These are tokenistic benefits that most of the time benefits them because they want you to come and enslave for them. And so it's really not comparative. We think that companies that do not hold up to 50% of the market share could steal this. They should show how if you don't hold 80%, you cannot do this. 3, they say, well, taxes will be high, so the price will be comparative. This is an overly simplistic way of engaging an economic debate. Listen to this panel. Let me take you along. First thing, what we say is that on our side, in the worst case, and realize we are not defending having foreign multiple companies. That's an unfair comparative. On our side, what we say is this. They need to defend a world where you support their continuous investment, which means that their 80% should still grow. That's why Vincent says they should still expand to take 90%. They are continuing in their expansion, which means that competition reduces by and by because you want them to continue. They don't defend anybody. They are terrible. Secondly, they say that, well, states will be able to oppress small guys. How can you say that our world is the world that protects small businesses and you say states will oppress small businesses? We think that that is something that you cannot buy in your deliberation. This is the comparative. 1, we say that even if small corporations are not able to scale up enough, we will increase the taxes of those monopolies until they are able to have prices more expensive. 2, he concedes that Africans are poor. It's unclear how, if you tax those companies so much that other things become cheaper, they would still want to buy Milo because, well, Milo has brand. Poor people like commodities. They don't look for luxuries. Third thing, we say that when we do it, we are able to allow those small companies to expand bit by bit. It is a progressive thing. 4, we are able to do this in an incremental stage such that we don't need to break down every monopoly before our world can be done. We can do things like progressive taxing to make sure that the more you scale up, the more you are taxed. This is able to progressively shift the market's dynamics, and that is why our world is better. Yes.
So the problem with your case is that at best, you strip consumers of choice. Defend why the inability of consumers to make choice is a good thing.
No, we don't strip them of choice. We allow more choice because on that side, those companies, what if I want to buy local chocolate, but the local chocolate company is going broke and I have to deal with Milo because Milo is everywhere and I can't get it because those local companies cannot scale up. You should show why everybody wants the foreigners instead. Closing.
The problem is you're not engaging the real counterfactual. The counterfactual of a monopoly is catalyzation. Engage that.
You can come and defend that in your world. A lot of things in clarity. 1, the debate casts a judgment on an existing phenomenon. What we say is that the existence of those monopolies, regardless of government contention, looks like these things. 1, African states are left behind in the old world order, and they are now struggling to scale up and move from consumerism. 2, these states have indigenous ideas and startups that are trying to scale up locally and internationally. Those people are blocked by these companies. 3, lobbying is a big problem. That's why you cannot allow them to lie, because if all those things existed, you wouldn't have corruption in Africa and terrorism. What it means is that lobbying affects a lot of things. 1, those companies have full market control. 2, they are able to evade tax. It means that even if we tax them now, we are taxing you from the tax that you've not paid since the time you came to Africa. You pay all of it now. What it means is this. You have created a job culture in Africa. What it means is those people absorb our worker force into their schools and their scholarship schemes to prevent them from coming back to work for competition. 5, what it means is that you need to access the credit system in these ways. 1, banks don't see the reason to invest in startups because those startups have lower potential and they don't see why they should give them loans to be able to match up the competition. That's why Vincent is lying. Secondly, shares and stocks do not get a lot because more people want to invest in those MNCs who are monopolies and can withstand market shocks. What it means is they need to show why, in spite of all these things, those companies will scale up. 5, we say that in principle, Africa is home to all those factors of production: food, silicon, copper, cobalt, for many of these consumer bodies. 6, it means that regardless of everything, these Africans cannot be able to access the full response of these things and these benefits that they've been given to these foreign companies. What are these impacts? 1, we unlock a lot of impact aside being able to manipulate pricing, because most of these times, these people are able to escape things like court systems because they have so much money. 2, they're able to prevent the state from going so hard of them because the state is afraid that those companies would leave. 3, what we say is that in most of the time, there is capital flight because realize most of these things are foreign companies. 4, we say that even though our world is progressive, our world gives a sustainable mechanism for Africa. Why? Because it is principally wrong for those who have the factors of production to be the ones who struggle to produce inherently. What we do is that we say that if African companies have proximity to all those resources, we should be the chief consumers and the chief producers. To the extent where our model is feasible, they need to show why a world of tax evasion and predatory policies is better than a world where Africans can consume other things made by other Africans. Proud OO.
I would like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. Before I invite the speaker, I would like to ask for order. So kindly, guys, if you need to speak, speak in a lower tone so we can be able to hear the speakers. Equally, the speakers speaking in the back, try speak in a lower tone so we're able to hear the speaker audibly. Apart from that, we now would like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the debate. Hear, hear.
I intended to. All right, so I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the illusion you get with the idea that choice is maximized when we have multiple options is one that is particularly ridiculous. Because multiple options does not necessarily mean better facilitation of consumer choice. Multiple options basically means you have another thing you could get. If you still say you want to get MTN as opposed to Vodafone, which we are providing you, we are going to break down MTN to a point where you have no option but to choose Vodafone because it is the cheapest available alternative. What that means then is that in their world, what government does is that it, through draconian policies, influences the decision-making process that goes into the options that exist. So, at best, they'll give you 3 more companies, but they would structurally situate the market in a nature that makes it impossible for you to choose MTN or any CCM in that regard. Why is that bad? Because such a system is primarily similar to the very thing that they are opposed, which are traditional monopolies. And this primarily engages their case because, see, in debates, when you hear the word monopoly, you go crazy. Bad, it's negative. But recognize that consumer choice monopoly are different from traditional monopolies. Here's why. Traditional monopolies that exist primarily because of 2 things. 1, it is either they are state sponsors, They are state-sponsored. This looks like Dangote Cement in Nigeria in the 20th century, in the early 21st century, where the government specifically prevented any other option from being existent just so that Dangote could build his millions. Why is this primarily bad? Because this is eerily similar to what these guys are proposing, where the state interferes with the market so that everybody chooses everything except a particular good. Why is that bad? Because it signals to other individuals who want to enter your market that if you do too well, the market is going to be stacked against you because the government hates it when they see someone succeeding. Why is this primarily important? We think that what this means then is that you create an inavailability of foreign direct investment or any level of corporations trying to succeed. You make them become mediocre. They give consumers shitty goods because they know if I feed you too much and you become too happy, you recommend me to too many people, and that's bad. But that's even illogical to begin with. You are forcing corporations to go against the very reasons why they exist, which is to make profit and to make people buy their goods. We think that in of itself is an unreasonable leverage to place upon them. But beyond that, we think a lot of traditional monopolies exist because of corporate espionage, to the very extent where a lot of these individuals that they talk about have a reasonable level of verisimilitude because they are basically all the same. It means that the reason why all these companies who are CCMs are usually chosen is because what they offer is something that people want. What this means then is that at best, since you do not strip them of their competitive advantage, which probably comes from trade secrets or from particularly patented things that only them can provide, people would still buy what they offer. Best thing you can do, kick them out of your state. If you kick them out of your state, it's more ridiculous. People will still freaking import what they offer because what they offer is unique and it's special because of trade secrets. But beyond that, let's engage a couple of ridiculous things they say. They say, well, the market is saturated, people would not want to enter. Even in a saturated market, they still sell stocks. Just last year, MTN sold stocks for average Ghanaians. Even Aisha bought some with her phone. We think these are things that could happen in status quo. They say people would buy from other individuals. I already showed you the structural barriers that exist and would not make people buy from other individuals, trade in secrets, etc., etc. Then the most brilliant thing they say, which they want to backload on Kojo's speech, is that foreign direct investments would still exist on both sides because you can invest into local companies. Two observations. Observation number one, investments made into any company, be it local or foreign, it is one that is supposed to make that company become a significant market power eventually. I am investing so that you can get more profit for me. So at best, you create a cyclical nature of the very problem that you are identifying. We think that in either world, there would still be a significant market power. But why do we prefer one that is existent because of consumers? Because it means that we grant consumers the power to choose, which is the most important thing in an economy. Because once you interfere with the invisible hands of demand and supply, you inherently fuck up your economy. Pardon my French. Second observation with that case is that the profits that are made when a foreign direct investment is made even to a local company, they still freaking go to the white guy that invested into that company. There is still capital flight in your world. It is symmetric. There is no gain. Why is it particularly worse off in their world? Because what you do actively is that at best, you create multiple companies. But why do we know that all the problems of multiple companies are worse off in their world? See, what makes these CCMs unique is that they are empowered by their consumers. What this means is that they value the consumers to the nth degree. What that inherently creates is a market where consumers are at the center of everything they do. What this looks like is that if particularly consumers hate a particular policy that these governments are instituting, these CCMs can threaten to leave just like Vincent tells you, and it creates an availability for them to intervene on behalf of their consumers. But before that's opening,
Realize how they misconstrue our case. Our case exists on a spectrum where you can exist and cooperate with others without taking all the market. You should show
yeah, guy, why would I want to cooperate when I create my own company? I didn't create a company to share the profits with everybody in this room. I created it because I want to make money. It's common sense. But beyond that, why is cooperation worse? Cooperation is worse because of trade unions. What happens in their world is that the whole industry gangs up to screw everyone over. And because they know that consumers would eventually choose one of them, they create an availability of consonants where they say, if the government does not provide us this as an industry, we are going to screw you over and stop providing you with our services. That is worse off because the government cannot necessarily even have an alternative. In our world, let's say the CCMs are bad guys and they want to push the government. Given that there are alternatives and these things exist, now people or the government can now say that individuals can choose because nobody forced the CCM to be draconian. They decided to be so. But beyond that, consumers themselves would opt out because they think that these guys are bad. That's why woke people are opting out of Apple and the likes because they are doing bad things. In our world, we protect the most important actor, which is consumers, and we protect Africa from having a horrible economy. Very proud to make it to the finals.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. Now I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the debate. Here.
So I'm going to start my speech. I will prioritize PI from closing. So in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I would like to point out here is to explicitly, mechanize how we grow local companies on our side. We think that, and this is very important because if you're able to grow local companies, you're able to have more of these things existing, it unlocks several impacts and we co-opt them. So impacts like foreign direct investment, impacts like employment, we get all of those things on our side if I'm able to prove this to you. But these things are much more better because most of the salary, most of the remittances stay within our country. On their side, most of the money that they accrue from these particular monopolies go up. But an important thing that these guys must defend in the continued existence is how their market, proportion on their side continues to grow and expand. So Vincent said 80%. They have to defend a world where it grows 90%, and which means that local companies like die out to the extent where they have about 10%, 5% of the market share. But why do we, make them better? Vincent points out the mechanism, which is we are going to tax them. When we tax them, it means that their prices are going to be very, very high. The issue is this first mechanism. OG lies when they say that local companies are not well established. These particular companies are well established. They have documentation, they have structures, and they own some part. Because if you are not well established, you cannot owe about the 20% and 10% market share that they talk about. But secondly, governments give them subsidies to help them. But the biggest problem why they do not grow is because these particular people, even when they get the help, even when they're able to produce their goods, do not have consumers readily buying these things. And so they make losses, and some of them have to shut down, or they either make very small profit that is just enough for them to pay their workers without the ability to expand. It means that when we have a world where people are going to buy from them now because other taxes are high, they are able to expand. But let me weigh up why people are going to buy from them. Co-opting their mechanism. Africans are poor because they don't have money. But this, I'm going to weigh up why it's even much more like necessary in our side. It means that the poor person has no interest with following brand loyalty. We can agree that some people will still follow brand loyalty because they have money. But for the majority of Africans that are living in particular places that do not even have sufficient drinking water, that do not even have sufficient electricity, are most likely going to engage within their local industry because there's more proximity to them, and then the prices are significantly reduced, and these things happen to get to them. So it means that more people are going to be, are going to stop buying, and they're going to engage with us. And this is even more heightened because of issues like COVID and the unstable economy and how it's inflation. And so before COVID, you could go to the store and say, give me Pepsodent because it's 5 cedis. Now when you go and ask for Pepsodent, it's 13 cedis. It's unclear why I will still buy the 13 cedis because it's Pepsodent as opposed to choosing the local alternative that's most likely cheaper. If Africans are poor, the most reasonable thing for you to buy as a panel is that they are going to engage in buying cheaper things and not constantly going to do this because we have more people buying. What happens if you have more people buying? It means more profit for these particular local goods. And so on our side, we have more profit plus more people buying. So, we have the profit from people buying and the government subsidies, which means that these guys are able to expand. And in expansion, means that they are building more factories in other particular places. In expansion, they're able to do these things. Calvin tells you that we don't have to defend the world where it is, just one day because that's really unrealistic. So it's progressive. It means that progressively, we are able to grow some of these things. But the reason why they're able to, become better is that because, currently, you will not think about setting up a company to rival MTN because you know you cannot beat them. But if it's about setting up a company to beat, let's say, another one that another local is producing, you are most likely going to do this because one, you're able to access the government subsidy, and you're also able to target the niche market and still do these things. And so more people are right on our end, and we get more expansion. They build more factories. What does that mean to the debate so far? It means that one, the more you are expanding, the more you are employing local people, the more you are able to, get some of these things better for themselves. So all impacts on employment are still existent on their side. But employment is static on their side because these particular companies have already like 80%. They've already employed all the people that they want to employ already. So even if they are going to expand it, basically building one more factory. On us, we have 1 or 2 more factories in expanding. We have about 5 more or many more factories. So we employ more people on our side. If you wait today's debate on which side unlocks more employment, you have to vote OO into the final. But the most important thing here is on the second clash of FDI. These guys are, that's the thing. When companies are expanding, it means that their projections by economic newspapers, etc., equally come to light, and people project them that they are going to be unicorn companies. They are going to have this particular market share, and they are going to grow. Yes, POI.
Okay, you realize your case is contradictory because the only way you can expand is by winning competition, which consistently leads to a new monopoly. Explain.
That's the thing. We argue that more Africans are most likely going to go into particular companies because the competition is among their fellow Africans that are equally starting up. On your side, the competition is among like a monopoly who's already existent and is like Unilever. You are more likely not going to create these things. And so on our side, because of the competition, it means that you have 2 or 3 or more companies sprouting up in niche communities where they have niche markets that they can explore to, and they are successful. They provide like more employment. Given that your projections, your economic projections as to how you grow in the future becomes like better, it means that for the very reasons why they say FDIs would invest, they want to invest in you because when you grow, it means that they're able to tap their profits. And so because we give a better projection for local companies, FDI still exists on our side. But the reason why it's terrible for FDI to exist on their side is that because like these things are, these corporations in their world, these monopolists in their world are like are MNCs, and mostly like they have like foreign bases, mean that most of the profits go back to these particular countries for development. On our side, the FDI stay here because the companies existent on our side are local companies, and it trickles down. So for the same reason why they want to do like corporate social responsibility, the local communities also indulge in corporate social responsibility. But this time, because it's for their own communities, they are going to do more of them. Yes.
See, we agree that in the best case scenario, you help local companies to have more people to buy into their goods, but you don't respond to the biggest pushback of manipulating the choice that.
So yes, that was what I was going to get to. Manipulation. They consider these particular companies grow because they manipulate the market, and then they lobby government. In that same way, like it's justified for the government to also manipulate the government against them. And most importantly, it means that all their impact on choice and manipulating the government is more beneficial, and it's worth the trade-off because on our side, we are able to grow our local economies, and we are able to unlock impacts like federal like AFTA, federal like AU, federal local like regional committees, and ability to even engage in global trade. These things are ready trade-offs. It's unclear why African countries should trade off all of these particular impacts for trade in that particular regard. But the last 2 things, I think they mentioned like how monopolists check government. First of all, monopolists, and we don't need monopolists to check government. People should vote to check their government. It's unclear why that unique impact should work for them. But they say trade unions, the comparative is this: local trade unions who are citizens that have the right to check government are appealing the government that they want X and Y and Z. On their side, lobbying from big companies, right? And it's even terrible because these particular companies do not owe any, are not like part of the country, and it means that they do not have any incentive to make the country better. If trade unions are right on our side because there are more companies competing and they want better deals and want better taxation, it's better than letting like MNCs who are foreign nationals like lobby governments proudly open opposition.
would like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. Now like to welcome the member of government to begin the closing half. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Can everyone hear me? Okay, that's phenomenal. Is everyone ready? I'll take POS from closing up. I've noticed that they've been quite quiet in today's debate, so yeah. So, I will be starting in 3, 2, 1. Open opposition stops at semis for 2 reasons. 1, the first thing is this, right? The counterfactual is not logical. Because when you characterize the way monopolies work, you would understand that the factors that make monopolies exist means that the alternative cannot be multiple SMEs. Why? 1, is that the outcome of that is simple. Is that at the end of the day, only very few people can actually enter this market. And now you now have to combine the limitation of this market with willingness. This means that only a very small number of people actually enter this market. The thing is this now, is that the alternative is startups. Understand this, right? Is that the reason why startups work the way they do is that when you then invest a lot of money to them, in the long term, most startups collapse and reduce to 2 competitors. So for example, Uber only has Uber, Lyft, and Bolt, despite multiple people entering the market in the same place. Because the only way you can make profit as a startup is by creating things that are really cheap and then maximizing the economies of scale to enrich yourself. The outcome of that is that the comparative is cartels, they already mess up. But the problem with that is that their mechanism brings us back to monopolies. Because they claim that realistically, when these particular people enter the market and they compete, inevitably they continue to grow and expand. They intentionally refuse to explain the mechanism of growth and expansion. If there are 3 companies or 3 stores on this street, yeah, the only way one store can expand is by stealing customers from the other 2 stores. The outcome of that is that those 2 stores collapse, and then you become the 1 store left. So the mechanism of growth you create also creates monopolies. You are completely uncomparative in today's debate. Now, the only benefit you have in your world at this point is this, right? Is that at the point in time where you create this mechanism, the particular companies are local, and by extension, they bring money inside. I will give you that credit. I'm going to explain why it's still uncomparative in today's debate. Because of the mechanism of how most African states have protectionist policies in the status quo. 1, most times African states, including Nigeria, have policies that ensure that a certain amount of your shareholder content is given to locals in the space. It's why MTN in Nigeria and Ghana are both listed on their local stock exchanges, right? But it's also because they end up creating incorporated systems within those spaces, right? The outcome of that is that local citizens end up buying most of these shares, and by extension, the money doesn't leave because the dividend that is gotten from the profit ends up going back to local Nigerians, going back to local Africans, and staying in that space. But the next thing you need to get in context is simply this, right? Is that they also have an incentive to give out shares to very powerful Nigerians and very powerful Africans in general. Because there is the danger of being fucked over, and don't pardon my French, there's the danger of being fucked over by really, really problematic policies being made. And the problem here is simple, is that if you want to insulate yourself from those policies, have your stakeholders be in government and have them have sizable shares. So most times when these companies are penetrating the market, the very first thing they do is bring big businessmen and big politicians into their shareholders and into their market, which means a lot of the money still stays in Africa, still stays in those spaces. A good example is Flutterwave, right? About 2 or 3 of the board members of Flutterwave, which is a $1 billion company, are ex-CBN deputy governors, right? What that means is simple, right? If they are trying to make policies to screw over Flutterwave, they will intervene. And that means that, but in the same vein, they are the largest shareholders within those spaces. Put your hand down, I'm not taking you. Now, we now go on to give the context that allows us to win today's debate. Is that we need to understand that there is only one way to solve poverty in Africa, and it is through market economics and through market policies. Why? Because governments are apparently ridiculously shit for a bunch of reasons. 1, they are inherently poor, so they don't even have the money to spend to give people. Second of all, they are very corrupt, so they don't have, even if they try to spend the money, it usually doesn't go the way they plan. Finally, again, they have poor taxation policies, which means that they are really hard at accruing or taking away wealth from people. But finally, they also have IMF restrictions, because they've taken tons of loans from masses that create policies that allow them to not implement some forms of monetary policy to alleviate poverty, right? What that means is that the faith of the poor man in Africa is dependent on market economics. And we need to look closely at this, right? And this is the context that's going to win us today's debate. Poverty really sucks. Poverty is an assault on your dignity. At the point in time where experiencing and carrying out and even executing most fundamental human rights are dependent on access to wealth. Your right to life doesn't matter if you don't have food. Then we need to save a lot of these people, and they're the most fragile demographic. But even if you don't buy that, population-wise, Africa has a greater majority of poor people than even middle-class or balanced people, right? So when it comes to just a numbers game, they are the most sizable, demographic in today's debate, and we still have an obligation to help them. How do we help them? We think that the best ways to benefit poor people through market policies are simple, right? One, you need to lower the cost of goods, you need to create stable wages, and you need to make predictable pricing. How do we lower the cost of goods? One, on the question of the balance of trade, put your hand down. The balance of trade is simple. The biggest problem African countries have is that they don't produce internally, right? So they create raw materials, they export, and then they have to buy it back. The problem is that you can never be on the winning side of that trade if you are buying a good that has been improved in quality. Because if I sell you like a loaf of bread and give it back to me as a sandwich, I'm obviously making a loss, or I have to lose more money. What this means is that it cripples their currency, right? It weakens their currency consistently. The outcome of this is that you consistently have a situation where your currency can only afford less and less goods, and because you can only afford less and less goods, the prices of things consistently keep rising. What happens when you have a monopoly? When you have a large monopoly in an industry, it becomes ridiculously profitable to have your factory within that country. Because if you are selling to if you own like 80% of the Nigerian market, which might be like 100 million, if you are selling like Cadbury, Bonvita, or Milo, yeah? That means you have an 80 million market. Transporting 80 million or shipping 80 million like worth of goods of Cadbury is really expensive, right? What that means is that you have a unique incentive to domicile your industry there and produce there to benefit the market and benefit everyone in that system. The outcome of that is simple, right? Things become cheaper. You don't have to do the entire export back and forth. And it also trickles down to expanding and benefiting other goods, which is comparatively better. Second of all, they also employ people. What this means is stable wages for a lot of people that is significantly beneficial, right? But moving on beyond that, right, is the fact that there is predictable pricing. Because the reason why people are poor is because they usually can't plan. So if you, in a world where like prices shift and prices go crazy, right, you can't plan. Because if you have savings, right, the moment something goes wrong, you lose everything. But in a world where you have predictable pricing, right, because it's generated internally and it's not subject to like foreign markets and all of that, you can actually plan for the amount of money that you're spending and significantly work to make those things better. We think that by extension, when you have predictable pricing, you can probably save better and then leave poverty in that mechanism. First of all, notice that we're the only team that shows you a mechanism of how people leave poverty. But then we also go on to social development. You want to develop your market or develop a market that you have like significant control over, because by developing that market, they have more buying ability. So that's why MTN gives out free phones to people so that they can end up using MTN and end up like becoming part of that market. So that means that there's also a unique incentive to drive up those particular structures and inevitably give people access to a lot of development. There will be more clarity coming from my whip. We are very proud to be in the finals. We love you all.
We'd like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. We'd now like to welcome the member of opposition to continue the debate. Here. Guys, order please. Kindly speak a bit lower. We need to be able to hear the speaker.
I'm Desmond. I'll be the lead member of opposition for the debate. I'll take a POI from each side of the bench. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The problem with consumer monopolies is not just because they are dangerous and they are monopolies. The problem, it's deeper and it's very, very pernicious when you know that people depend on these things for day-to-day usage. What does this look like? It looks like things like food people eat, businesses people engaging in, etc., which means that the movement of money every day depends on people like MTN, etc. It means that things like taking of breakfast depend on people like Milo, Nestle, etc. What does that mean? Any shift, any break, any increase of price, any mismanagement that hits these monopolies are things that affect the countries the most. That's why this debate is not just because monopolies exist, let's break them down. It's because of the huge dependency and how anything that affects them can concretely shake any economy in any community. That is the reason why the debate is very important, and that's the reason closing opposition will win the debate. We establish the agency opening opposition never provided to you in this debate. 3 sentimental tricks that opening government and closing try to play on you guys in this debate. Realize, on our side, when people form these things and they start, right, the first thing then to say is on a moral desert, something OO doesn't take out. OG argues, and it's a frame that CG takes, that people got these things because they were good guys, they were hardworking. This is the case. 1, people get most of these things because they have active lobbying. When they enter the states and they captured states early, that looks like things like preferential tax holidays, people lobbying and having politicians in hand and being in bed with politicians. 2, it looks like things like I'm going to be very blunt with it, like colonization, etc. The Royal Dutch Company, which is the Nestle company that exists today, didn't get its advantages because it was so hardworking, because if you don't depend on Milo, we will die. It was because of cheap labor. It was because they got active incentives through this history of plunder and shackling that other people did not get. This is the reason that they got this thing. The second thing then to say, that even if you don't buy these 2 things, is the early state capture. After these guys left and the economists were left, active people took these things, right? Which means there's been government interest in some of these things. Look like giving people like Dangote, etc., tax holidays, etc., are things that build them up, right? What is this to say? The argument that these people have these things because they deserve them and things that are true, and we'll show you why on a wide spectrum these are untrue things. But even if you do not buy that, we have 4 extensions on the reason why consumer companies must be broken down. 3 things then to take out OG and CG consequentially. If you talk about this, the second sentimental trick they play is things on the ability to take shockwaves, etc. This is the thing. When new markets come, right, our side says it's going to be fair investment. Even before that, the second piece of clarity we'll make is on the issue of cyclical nature of people becoming monopolies. You break them down, another person comes, and we break them down. Something OO did not respond to. This is how we respond to this. We establish that there has been an unfair advantage that people stand on. What does this mean? When we break these guys down and everybody invests afresh, which means this debate is in a context where this ends in this status quo, which means people who necessarily start do not use unfair advantages to gain this sort of monopolies, which means for that one going, these monopolies are rather going to be the ones that have a fair advantage that operates because they literally got these things. That is why the cyclical nature, even if it exists, are things we like. Second thing that they talk about is on things such as, well, they will not have enough money to take the shockwaves, etc. Open does what when talks about how status quo does not agree that DRC, etc. Even in Ghana, when inflation is at its highest, Milo is still there. They've necessarily not run away. On our side, see, people still invest a lot of money. It's not because these guys are new. Being new doesn't mean you don't have a lot of money. Still, people can invest in you. Still, you can get so much sources of investment to be big, which means that shockwaves are things you can avoid. When new companies come, they come with new innovations. They do market research. They make sure they do not fail, which means that they are prepared. We do not only show you that it's something that happens, we mechanize how these things work. The second thing they talk about then is on the issue of social corporate responsibilities. Everybody can do social corporate responsibilities. That should not be a reason why you should have a monopoly. We do not think that tokenistic thing, as they said, is the thing. The reason why people engage with consumer companies is not because they are consumers and because they love it so much. A monopoly means what? They were the only ones available. That means it was not because Milo has a secret ingredient, that's why I'm taking it. It's because Milo was the only thing that was freaking available. Which means when we give these people much more things that they can engage with, which means that these guys should, right? Things like advertising because they have so much money, right? Which doesn't give other people the opportunity and the advantage to engage with these things. Everyone then has an equal way to advertise their business, right? We break down those things they had, those shackles and those free things that gave them the advantage to do these things. We think that is very bad. The first thing we'll talk about then is going to be on decentralization and why this is important. For consumer companies, as we posit, that the agency that exists here is very high. It means in a world where there is a mismanagement, it means in a world where any of these tele companies is hacked, it means a world where anything bad happens to these people because they are monopolies leads to a shockwave. And Tembani and me argued this previously, and you told me to work on this, right? What does that look like? When there are shockwaves, these people can no longer give these things to these guys as possible, and they are the only ones that existed. What does that mean? We create a world where these things that economies thrive on, that people use to survive and are subsistent on every day are the whims and caprices of only one person being able to give this thing when they are consumer frigging productions. We think there's a reason why we actively need to spread these things across. Newer people need to take this, and why it's only morally obligated, like this, or like POI.
So we think that things like shockwaves.
I took it before the time.
We think that things like shockwaves usually exist.
Continuing, panel. See, things like shockwave would exist, but when it is far spread across, it takes only one out. There are actively other people that can engage in this. Extension then is to talk about investors. Like, I think that's a wash. Investors will always come. That's not a debate. The second one that we'll talk about is competition. Competition is not only enough to, like, there are other people that can compete against you, as Owo said. This is why it's very important. Until we get enough competition, the incentive to always industrialize, something Africa lacks, is not something that we'll always get, right? Growth are things that we'll get on our side. It means things that can gatekeep people from entering, right? When there are more, like, when we do not break these guys down, there's always going to be that active gatekeeping that stops people from entering. There's always going to be that limiting, right? That's why when they say prices are predictable and consistent, it's a lie. The reason why prices hike is because sometimes they want to reduce the prices to prevent other people from engaging in this. That's why people like Pampers, people like that give baby diapers, MTN, etc., would always increase their prices. They are never the same on every side of the globe, right? At the end of the day, this is what we do. We provide you the agency, and what is very important as a consumer company, we showed you why we need to decentralize this, because we depend on this. And also, at the end of the day, we tell you that African systems are too weak to counteract this. This law is the only thing that breaks them down. Proudly closing opposition.
We'd like to thank that speaker for that speech. And guys, I kindly ask again, please keep your voices down. We really need to be able to hear the speakers within the debate. Apart from that, we would like to welcome the next speaker to continue the debate. Yeah. Guys, kindly keep the voices down. If it's something very urgent, you can always step out for a bit.
So, panel, there's a reason why I see you shout a lot into this debate, because no analysis, just make a lot of noise, so we get confused. So, panel, understand that, the biggest case that they give you is that, see, there's a massive risk involved when these monopolies pull out, right? We think that that's true, but it's not impactful in today's debate because of certain incentives that will prevent these guys from pulling out, right? We think we're talking about Africa here. We don't think these guys actually engage in today's debate, right? So, the thing they tell you that this happens even, see, our rebuttal to this is that this happens even in small businesses, right? Because they are subject to shipping costs and environmental factors, which these small companies do not have, right? But big companies have these shipping costs and environmental issues to actually cover these things. They have insurance money that we think small companies do not have. But how is this very, very much applicable? For instance, in the case where, cocoa, for instance, is not properly stored by small startups and all, these local, businesses or these local farms, it becomes very problematic where they get consumed by things like locusts, right? Because they don't have these proper storage facilities that we think is very important in today's debate. But you cannot do that comparative with big, companies, because we think it's very, very more important to understand where the clash is in today's debate. The clash is not whether, when you take away these guys, Africa becomes better, right? But the comparative, I will get back to that. Due to exploitation, right? They said, okay, these big companies, found their grounds due to exploitation and all of those type of things. We think even if this this is true, how is it impactful in today's debate is a question that we necessarily need to ask. So if they got their grounds through exploitation, the solution is not to condemn people to hunger, right? But to tax these guys ridiculously, and we think that problem is a governmental issue and not, the engagement that these guys give you. Because if you tax this guy ridiculously, that's in the world where, they exist because of, exploitation and all of those things, the solution to that is to tax them and not, necessarily condemning people to hunger. Panel, there's a huge bias that exists against companies, and, capitalists when it comes to, monopolies and all of that. So in this type of debate, a lot of assumptions are just going to fly because people will automatically think, that monopolists, and capitalists are bad. But today's debate will not exist on that grounds, right? Because we must understand that the proposition in today's debate is for we to weigh the economic benefits on one hand as against the harms, right? So if those economic benefits and those scales that we measure outweighs those ridiculous harms that they tell you, because even if we agree they are bad, what's better for Africa and what's better for the poor is the most important thing in today's debate. Something IAFA gives you, these guys don't engage, they say they are exploitative, they form because of, exploitation and, large subjugation, so therefore let's take them out. We think that's a world where we don't want in the first instance. We think OO was more relevant than them, so let's spend some time engaging OO. So OO's problem is that we want an Africa that we actually have local consumption and local production, right? They need an Africa where we can prioritize Africa consumption, right? We think this is good, but that assumption that monopolies exist and then this becomes mutually exclusive is wrong, right? Because we think that it's a case of priority, right? Because governmental policies of economic expansions can also operate even when, large monopolies still exist within that space. These guys assume that unless you take away monopolies, you cannot locally develop, and we think that's a problem on their side. Because when they tell you ridiculous arguments like, you cannot access loans because, you are in competition with these big monopolies. Loan is a monetary policy that is controlled by the central bank, which means that largely controlled by, those governmental systems. It becomes a case of priority. So if government will engage in things like fertilizer reduction loan for people, to engage local farming, it's also good. And if your government chooses to, prioritize giving loans to those big companies, it becomes a governmental policy issue and not because these guys primarily exist, right? We think this is very important in today's debate, right? So if I'll take you.
Even if we create cyclical monopolies, foreign monopolies are terrible because most of the benefits go back to their states of origin. Local monopolies are better than the death of innovation of young African minds, and most likely the benefits all stay here in Africa.
But now the reason why he still asks this PY is because he fails to understand the comparative that exists in today's debate, right? Because the next thing we tell you is that, we do not necessarily create a world where this debate becomes a world where, monopolies should exist or monopolies should not exist. But the comparative of the impact that it has on African states, our bench, Gulf bench, OG tells you that, we need economic development, and that can only happen in the presence of these monopolies, right? And we think that's true. The impact to which they tell you is that, we need things like economy of scale. IAFA comes and IAFA tells you that, there's a priority that everybody, fails to look at in today's debate. And that's the idea of poverty elevation for Africans, right? There's a reason why today's debate is discussing about Africans, right? So, beyond OG just giving you that, this will work through economies of scale, we show you the impact of this. Now, what is the impact? We think that economy of scale increases the mass of production, which means that you now have more goods, that now becomes that, you have to sell those goods cheaper. Prior to that, you have local producers who are going to spend more in producing goods, which makes the goods inherently expensive. Now, the target to this is that it creates something very, very problematic for African states, and that is inflation. Because to the extent to which these guys are unable to even meet up with the necessary goods that will feed the quantity of people that exist within Africa, then more money chasing less goods, which will increase the price of these commodities, which makes it very, very much problematic within the economy. In their world, they increase employment. How do you increase employment? Even if we agree that they increase employment on that class, let's show you how it's even worse off on the crowding out effect that you cause. Because let's take out everybody employed by, monopolies presently and say, let's engage their world of employment, right? There's an employment that causes a larger level of unemployment that will exist within African states. This is a problem, right? Because they say, if you increase, production, you don't get an increased level of employment. The reason why they engage that is because OG did not give, the transformation mechanism of that. If you increase production, right, the next thing to do, the idea of increasing production in the first instance means that you must employ more people to engage more labor to increase that production. Secondly, that's an increased level of employment. It means more money, it means more income, it means increase in aggregate demand. That means people have more money to spend within that same economy, which means there's a rotation of money within African spaces. Absence of this is inflationary. People have a lot of money chasing few goods. IAFA gives you something very, very, important in today's debate that these guys don't argue. That development that comes to society, that societal development that we speak about. Because if a company like MTN should exist within the space of society, giving people things like phones so that they can actually access their use and their thing, it creates a sort of knowledge transfer and a better society for us. We engage that word, these guys don't. Today's debate is a comparative of how do we best treat the idea of hunger, inflation, and all the problems that exist within Africa. If you take away these guys, we don't have production at a large scale. People are subjugated to things like, buying things at very, very high prices, and they can't even feed in any ways. It's very, very much expensive to run without these guys. We think we're proud to win. See you in the finals trial. Okay.
So we'd like to thank that speaker for that speech. We'd now like to welcome the last speaker of the House to conclude the debate. Here.
Can you hear me? Okay. So starting, so if everybody's saying something, I have just something simple to say. Today we settled the Jollof Wars between Ghana and Nigeria because 2 Ghanaian teams are going to the finals. Yeah, so starting in 3, 2, 1. So first, why do we beat our opening opposition? First, because we are the ones that contextualize this debate. This debate is not just about monopolies, it is about consumer monopolies. This has 2 effects in today's debate and feeds into an argument on urgency, because you don't get that from our opening. Why it is more urgent for us to do that? First, because of the dependency syndrome that we analyze, that day to day, we rely on these consumer products that are produced by these monopolies. It means that they have significant power over us and over our states, and how they are able to influence us in that regard. We think that power that we are giving to them is one that is illegitimate in that regard, and they can hurt us in that regard when they live out in that they live. The next thing is how a ripple effect, when there is a shock to these companies, affects the whole economies within which these monopolies are existent in. It means that when they are leaving these countries or something bad happens to these monopolies, a lot of employees are going to be losing their jobs in that regard, but also a huge chunk of the revenue stream that government relies on is one that will be lost. What is the comparative on our side? When one small company gets, an economic bad upturn and all those stuff, it means that the impact is reduced to that small company. It's as opposed to a wide number of employees, as opposed to a wide number of revenue streams to government. We think that our world is much more urgent in that regard. The impact weighing is that, one, our impacts are much more wider in terms of how the harms of their world are much more wider and reduced in our world, and much more deeper in their world and reduced in our world in that regard. Last thing why we beat our opening is because they don't respond to the cyclical monopoly that argument these people make. Because it's a very important argument these people make. If you are breaking those monopolies and they will constantly come up again, you have basically failed in that regard. We show you why first, there will not be a cyclical monopoly in the first place. But secondly, even if there's a cyclical monopoly, that in itself is justified. We beat opening opposition in today's debate. The next team we tackle is CG. So what does CG bring? First, they say that there's an inefficiency of states, there's poverty and all those stuff. So in our world, they create lower cost of goods. The first part of our case shows that that is a fallacy, that we really don't get this lower cost of goods. But that lower cost of goods usually happen at certain points where they want to hurt smaller companies. But generally, usually their prices are much more expensive. I think MTN has the most expensive data system in Africa. I think Pampers, as opposed to other diapers, are more expensive. I really don't know how they have sold a trick, and it has run down. I openly engage, it has run down to the end, that these people have the cheapest prices. I really don't know. But monopolies usually in Africa specifically have the highest price. Example, Wave in Senegal in that regard, and we are the only ones that challenge that in that regard. The next thing that they say then is that if because of this lower cost of goods, there's predictable pricing. I really think that is ludicrous. Why? Because predictable pricing is not premised on the company's proclivities. It's dependent on certain economic factors like inflation and government policies. If they increase, these companies will also have their pricing increasing. So there's nothing like predictable pricing, and they cannot win in that regard. Example, the price of Pampers data beverages have since time immemorial been increasing. I don't think they have been predictable for most of us. We have still not been planning in that regard. The next thing why they can't win, CG can't win, is because one, this is a policy motion and not a support. It's a support motion and not a policy motion. What do? They mechanize how they make poor people advance and all those stuff. But in status quo, have these monopolies made poor people advance? They have rather repressed them. You can't mechanize the future. When the support motion is analyzing status quo, they can't win in that regard. Poor people have been hooked to these expensive goods and they have not been able to escape it. They are becoming poorer because of this monopoly. First clash in today's debate is the facade of cheaper prices. So they are out. We win over our opinion. Let's engage the broader clashes in today's debate, and that will deal with the whole gap and most of the line of analysis you get. The first thing is a facade of cheaper prices. I've told you that these companies, because of how wide they have become, create a dependency syndrome. Even if you don't believe me, and you will buy into GAF case, because GAF has analyzed to you how, even if these countries go out, people still buy their goods. Why? They say because of things like brand loyalty and all those stuff. So you don't buy my analysis. Buy the analysis. What does that mean? It means they have created a dependency syndrome where they can exploit and increase their prices, but still people buy it. That's why MTN has the highest data price, but people still buy it in that regard. This means that there is an increase in prices, and that facade of cheaper prices that they told you about is something that is not false. Imagine you have a product, people will buy it, whether you increase it to $1 billion US. What do? You really increase it. I don't think you reduce it in that regard. You don't win on that crash. The next thing is how these monopolies developed. We don't think that these monopolies develop through competition or fair competition or equal competition as they sell to you. We think that the greatest lie is that monopolies develop through equal or moral desert. A monopoly is usually able to exist if the government interferes in the market, that's the free market, usually by helping one actor to the disadvantage of other actors in the market. This helping hand takes a number of forms, as my partner analyzed you, such as giving preferential treatment to other companies like tax holidays and sometimes state capture where they escape regulatory policies. He added something on colonialism. That's how some of these companies even develop. I don't really want to analyze that, really research that. We don't want to be the conspiracy theories over here, such as the Dutch West African company and the Unilever and how they were able to use free labor in that regard. So it's not because of moral desert. What does that mean in today's debate? One, it means that there's a principal justification for breaking them up, even if our world ends up in failing. Our opening doesn't provide that principal justification. But even if there's a cyclical monopoly rising up again, it means that at least because of that equal grounds that we have now created by breaking them into equal companies, that means that we are fine with any later monopoly that may develop, because that monopoly has now developed through fair competition. In their world, the monopolies that exist right now did not develop through fair competition, but because of the helping hand that the government afforded them in that regard, our world provides much fairer monopolies, even if there are monopolies here.
So these companies are usually multinational corporations. So even if their local company experiences a shockwave, they can import money from another branch in the US, another branch in Dutch. But beyond that, even if they establish themselves through colonialism, they don't do it any longer.
Yeah. They will import the money after a lot of people have lost their jobs. They will import the money and much more companies after those harms has affected us already. We prevent that harm in the first place by not letting so large a monopoly to happen so that they hurt a lot of people in that regard. The argument on choice and why we really win that, because our case, all our case shows that we are really not, these people are not really exercising consumer choice. Why? Because their consumer architecture has been messed up. Because when these guys want to buy products from the smaller companies, these monopolies reduce their prices to abnormal extent so that the smaller companies cannot exist, lose out, and drop out. There's no really choice. That choice has been faked up, and it's not a nuanced one. The real choice exists in our side, where because of fair competition we have, because you are breaking them all down to a much more level ground, now wherever they are buying is because they really want in that regard. We tell you how necessarily there's agency on our side. There has never been a greater time for Africa to solve this thing, but I'm depending on people whose very demise will lead to a demise as well in that regard. We resolve the clash on cyclical building of new monopolies, and we have shown you how necessarily our world helps Africa, and especially in context of consumer, consumer monopolies. Thank you.
Would like to thank the speakers and our esteemed audience. It's been a fantastic debate, and we wish you guys all the best.